we're going to read today. I'm going to start in a couple of verses here, and I'm going to skip around, I think, a little bit. So let's go ahead and start from verse 19. Exodus 4, verse 19. Now the Lord has said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead." So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand. Verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, 'This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refuse to let go, so I will kill your firstborn son.'" Skip ahead to verse 27. The Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say, and also about all the signs he had commanded him to perform. Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. Last week I talked about when God calls. 2 weeks ago, we talked about God's calling. Last week I said, when God calls, He promises to be with us. And the truth that I want to kind of continue to build upon this morning is that when God calls us, not only does He promise to be with us, but as we see in the life of Moses, He provides the means to accomplish it. Okay, not only does God call us and promise that He's going to be with us, but God also provides the means so that we can do the work that He calls. I think there is a misunderstanding of how God works. And we kind of see it in the life of Moses as well, in Moses' life. We sense God's calling upon our lives. Maybe some of you have experienced, I feel like God is calling me to do something. And you think, there's no way I can do this. So you're kind of like Moses, and you just kind of go through all of the emotions and all of the logic and the arguments and the counter arguments in your head. And after a while, after you pray, you feel like, okay, this is something God is really telling me to do. So you agree to do it. The misunderstanding occurs when we think that maybe we're reluctant like Moses was because of a certain weakness in our life, a shortcoming. The misunderstanding occurs when we feel like, okay, when I say yes to God, He's going to fix my weakness. He's going to fix my shortcomings. Because without that, there's no way that God can use me. That's kind of our reasoning. We expect God to heal us so that He can use us. But what do we learn in not just our own experiences, but in the story of Moses? God will use us despite whatever is lacking. He doesn't need to fix those areas to use us. He doesn't need for those shortcomings to be taken care of, to be fulfilled. When He calls and when we respond in faith, God sets us up for success. We are set up for success. And that's something that we have to believe. When God calls us, He promises to be with us, but He's also going to enable us to succeed by giving us or providing us the means to do it. In the life of Moses, we see this being played out. So what are some things that we see in this story today in Exodus 4? First thing I see when I read this passage, the first thing that I see is this. God provides assurance that our past will not affect our current task. What I mean by that is this. Moses, when he's talking with God in chapter 3, one of the things that is on the back of his mind is what? I cannot go back to Egypt. Because the last time I was in Egypt, what happened there? He killed somebody, right? He saw an Egyptian slave master kind of being really harsh to an Israelite. And so he goes and actually he strikes him. And the guy dies. And Moses is like, oh, did anyone see that? And he kind of just runs away. The next day we're told in chapter 3, I think latter part of chapter 3, he saw two Egyptians or Hebrews fighting. And he said, hey guys, you guys are brothers. Why are you guys fighting? And to that, one of them said, who made you king over us? What are you going to do? Are you going to kill us like you killed that guy yesterday? Moses got really afraid at that moment. And so he ran away from Egypt. He ends up in Midian. That's where kind of the story picks up. The past for him was one of great anxiety. If he returned to Egypt, what would happen to him? Would people recognize him? Oh, you're that guy. Does Pharaoh have a warrant for his arrest? These are some of the anxious thoughts that's going through Moses' mind. God provides assurance that our past will not affect our current task. God reassures Moses that it's safe to return to Egypt. Verse 19, it tells us, the people that wanted to kill you, they are dead. You know, this is the beginning of, obviously, holiday season. Christmas is in 2 Sundays from now. 14 days now from Christmas. After the birth of Jesus, Mary and Joseph are what? They hurriedly escape. And what are they told by the angel? Go back now. Because the people who wanted to harm you are dead. We've pointed out several parallels between this story of Moses and what we see in the New Testament, the birth of Christ. And this is another similar thing. Moses can now return to Egypt because the people who wanted to kill him are dead. Mary and Joseph can now return to Jerusalem because the King Herod who wanted to kill him was dead. So we see that similarity. Go back to Egypt. It's okay. It's safe. God eases Moses' mind from this anxiety. There are times when we are called to a task and we are anxious because of our past sins. God, I know that you're calling me to do this, but I have not been very good. I've made mistakes in the past. I believe that disqualified me from service, from the work that you have called me to do. Sometimes others are so quick to point that out to us. Hey, how can you do this? Don't you remember? They're quick to point out our past sins and tell us that we're disqualified for service. But God says this, I've called you, I'm going with you, I've forgiven the past. In fact, I will use your past to accomplish my greater purpose. You see, one of the things that Moses feared was his past sin. And God says, I'm calling you. In fact, rest assured that your past will not affect your current work. Your past will not affect your current task, the task that I have called you to do. When you go back, everything will be okay. Our past is in the past. And sometimes we have such a hard time. God has forgiven us, but sometimes we don't forgive ourselves. Sometimes we are hesitant because of that. And God wants to remind us this morning, your past is in the past. It will not affect how I want to use you in this current task. Moses' past isn't used to judge him. His past doesn't disqualify him. God sends him back because he is not disqualified for service. What's the second thing that I see in this story in Exodus 4 is this. God will accomplish his purpose through our shortcomings. Moses had a speech problem. That's one of the conversations that he has with God. Hey, God, I don't know if you remember, but I'm not very good with words. I stutter. I become tongue-tied. So that was his problem. He was called for a job, however, that required public speaking. If he's going to be a spokesperson for God, if he's going to lead the people out, he has to stand before Pharaoh and think about Moses, what he's going through his mind. I'm going to stand before Pharaoh, the king, and I'm going to get tongue-tied and my words are not going to come out. I'm going to look like an idiot. So that was his fear. And that's why he disobeyed, or he refused to obey God. But as we know, God still wanted to use him. God still called him. Because he was chosen for this moment. And the way that God reassures Moses, I think is kind of interesting. We see that Moses is not healed by God so that he can become a skillful speaker. Moses still is not very good with words. Moses still gets tongue-tied. Moses still doesn't have confidence in his ability to stand before people and speak. That hasn't changed. You would think that God would heal him. You would think that it would be a powerful message, right, assigned to Moses. Moses, I'm going to use you. Effect, boom. Words will just flow out of your mouth. You will be an elegant speaker. You would think that that's what God would do, but he doesn't do that. Instead, God gives Moses Aaron. God helps Moses speak by giving him someone to speak for him. Our shortcomings does not keep God from working through us. There's a guy named Jason Gray. I read a little story about him that I think is so relevant to what Moses is going through. He's a singer. Excuse me. He's a singer-songwriter, and he has a speech impediment. He stutters. Okay, he's a singer, and he stutters. And the one thing that could have held him back from actually, following after God's calling upon his life is what actually spurred him or propelled him into the spotlight. This is what he says. Either I'm crazy or it's God. It doesn't make any sense that a guy with a speech handicap would have a career where he has to be on stage. Of course, I was insecure about it always. When I was younger and began to be aware that God had a calling on my life, I was convinced that I had to be healed. I would tell the Lord, you can't make a spokesperson until you make it so that I can speak. But when you tell the Lord that he can't do something, it's a dare that he cannot resist. He began to put me in places where I had to speak, even though I didn't think I could do it very well. I learned early on that he uses us not in spite of our weaknesses, but more often than not, exactly because of our weaknesses. Here's a guy who has a speech problem. He calls it a handicap. And when he sensed God's call upon his life, naturally he expected God to heal him. Because he was thinking, how can you put me in front of people? How can you put me on stage with this handicap? God uses us in spite of our shortcomings. Our shortcomings, our weaknesses, they do not keep God from accomplishing his purpose. And we see that in the life of Moses. The third thing I see in this story is this: that God gives us strength to overcome opposition. We have to understand that when we are called by God to do his work, and when we actually go out and do it, even sometimes before, when we say yes and when we go out, we will face opposition. For Moses, he felt like the opposition would come from the Israelites. Surprisingly, however, that is not the group that brings opposition. Moses and Aaron, they return to Egypt. And they go to Egypt and they gather all the elders of Israel or the Israelites together. He brings them together. And Aaron is the one who's speaking. Aaron speaks and says, this is what happened as God has appeared to Moses, and he has sent us to rescue you. Moses performed the miraculous signs in front of them as God had commanded him to do. And in verse 31, we see these words, and they believed. The people were convinced that God revealed himself to Moses, and that what Moses was telling them, what Aaron was telling them, was true. Not only did they believe, when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them, at the end of verse 31, and has seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. All of their doubts, Moses, all of his doubts were wiped away by this miraculous signs. Moses doubted that the people would believe him. That's where he thought opposition would come, but it didn't come there. Moses found opposition from who? Pharaoh. When we look at this opposition of Pharaoh, and when we look at the beginning of this interaction that Moses has with Pharaoh, when we look at this section, there's one area that we have to kind of understand or resolve, and that is this idea of hardening of Pharaoh's heart. There's much debate about who hardened Pharaoh's heart. Was it God or was it Pharaoh? Scripture tells us it's kind of both, combination of both. But if you look at Exodus 4:21, I think this gives us an understanding of what was going on. Instead of the question of who hardened Pharaoh's heart, I want us to look at the question of what does it mean that his heart was hardened? What does that mean? And when you look at verse 21, it says this, Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Think about what the Israelites meant to the Egyptians. They were the labor force, free labor force. Egyptians, I'm sure that their life was very easy because all of the hard physical labor, the Israelites, the Hebrews were doing it. So all of a sudden, here's this guy who shows up and says, I want you to release my people. God says to release my people. Pharaoh's thinking, what are you? Are you crazy? Why would I do that? So the hardened, what does it mean that Pharaoh's heart was hardened? Whether it was God and whether it was Pharaoh. It's at the very end of verse 21. So that he will not let the people go. I think that's the key. Why would Pharaoh let them go? The hardening of the heart, it was rooted in Pharaoh's unwillingness to let the Israelites go. In another sense, I think, it's like this. Moses needs to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. This guy, Pharaoh, this king, he was not a godly man. In fact, he was a dictator who was overseeing the oppression and the suffering of an entire generation. He loved the slaves. Why would he let them go? The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is actually at the center is crucial to the eventual release. Without hardening of his heart, I don't think there is a release. Pharaoh needed a reason. He needed to be convinced that it was in his best interest to release the Israelites. So I believe that it's a combination of his heart being hardened, refusing, I will not let them go. And things begin to happen. And that's why I think we see so many the plagues that come. Each one continuing to test his resolve. Until he says, okay, I'll let you go. Only to change his mind. And that process repeats itself again and again and again, as we will look at in the coming weeks. As Moses faces the greatest opposition, God gives Moses strength and the means to overcome that opposition. And that's what the rest of this encounter is all about. Moses is provided the means to face the opposition. Moses is given strength to face opposition. How frustrating do you think it would have been for Moses? Every time he goes, he gets an assurance. Okay, you can go. Just tell God to take the plague away. He does. And they want to leave, and Pharaoh says, no, what are you talking about? I'm not going to let you go. He needed strength. He needed encouragement, and God provides that. I believe some of you are just like Moses, reluctant to step out in faith, afraid that you have a condition, a past sin that disqualifies you from service, that you're focused on your shortcomings, on your weaknesses, that it weighs you down. A pastor writes this: do you know that God can use you? Paul stated that his weaknesses guaranteed him greater strength. In 2 Corinthians 12:10, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, I am strong. Like Paul, you may look upon yourself as being weak and unable to do much for the cause of Christ. But God can use you. The truth of the matter is that God doesn't need us to be strong and able to stand up on our own 2 feet. He needs us to be weak and to be totally dependent upon Him and His power. God isn't looking for spiritual powerhouses. He is looking for people who have nothing more than faith and a desire to cling to the Lord. He is looking for people who say simply, use me, nothing more, nothing less. I have a friend who said this, who asked God this very question. A couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine from California visited, and we were talking. And he's getting more involved with. He went on a short-term mission trip to Haiti this past summer, and he got connected through some business leaders, small business leaders, and some pastors. And as they're talking, what nonprofit that they started was, how do we help people become self-sustainable in places like Haiti? And so these are all business people. So he's actually going to be going in January to Haiti, not as a mission trip, but through the nonprofit. They're going to go, and they're going with, I think they're giving each person $10,000. So they're going to bring people in, and they're going to share. People are going to pitch their business ideas to them. And they'll look over those and give out, 4 or 5, I think. What's that? Starter? What's that phrase? They're going to give out 4 or 5, lack of a better word, scholarships. They're going to give out, to 4 or 5 people the funds to launch that business. And as he was sharing with me, we talked about a mutual friend who asked this question: God, how do you want to use me? What do you want to do through me and my family? He asked God that question. They sold everything. He sold his business. He went to YWAM in Kona, Hawaii. And he's going through DTS right now, which is what they call discipleship training school with YWAM, which is an organization called Youth with a Mission. Here's a guy who sold his business, packed up his family from California, flew to Hawaii for 6 months of training, followed by 6 months of mission work. Just because he asked this question: God, how will you use me? Everything happened so fast for him. He's there. His kids are going to school there because it's a huge campus. Him and his wife are being trained. And they're sharing some things that God is doing in their life that more than him, I just see how his wife is just really just growing so much through this encounter. You see, God is simply looking for people. He doesn't want complete people who have it all together. Moses did not have it all together. But yet God says, you're the perfect person for the work that I have called. Your shortcomings, your weaknesses, they will not be a hindrance. Your past sins, they're not going to keep me from accomplishing my purpose through you. I will provide you the strength and the means to succeed. Moses was successful not because of his strengths, but because of his weaknesses. God used Moses in spite of all of his weaknesses to stand before the Israelites and prepare them for freedom and to go head to head with Pharaoh. Do you understand? Moses, he went head to head with the most powerful person of the time. Just a short time ago, he was content just sitting there watching his sheep. Just being a shepherd. And God moved so powerfully in his life that he is going head to head with Pharaoh, trying to win the release of the Israelites. God is looking for people who will say, Lord, use me. He has so much that he wants to accomplish. And yet I believe he's always on the lookout for men and women who will say, Lord, here I am. Will you use me? My heart's desire and my prayer is that in this room, in this church, that God would raise up men and women who say, Lord, here I am. Use me. I have all of these things. I know that. But I believe that you will set me up for success if I say yes. So Lord, use me. May that be our prayer this morning. Let's pray.